decade. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. This weekend, ACT UP, the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, celebrates its 25th anniversary. The International Direct Action Advocacy Group was formed by a coalition of activists outraged by the government's mismanagement of the AIDS crisis. On March 24, 1987, ACT UP staged its first major action, a die-in, with hundreds of protesters convening on Wall Street to demand access to experimental drugs and an end to discrimination against HIV-positive people. While most protesters stayed behind police lines, some crossed the barricades and sat in the street to block traffic. In total, 17 members of ACT UP were arrested, charged with disorderly conduct, and later released. The protest was the first in a long line of demonstrations, speeches, die-ins, political funerals, and marches that helped propel the HIV/AIDS crisis into the national spotlight. Over the years, ACT UP played a vital role in securing legislation, medical research, and treatments and policies. Now a new documentary about ACT UP and the history of the AIDS epidemic is screening Saturday in Manhattan. It's called How to Survive a Plague. It chronicles the rise of AIDS activism through the lens of those who captured it firsthand. It tells the heart-wrenching yet deeply inspiring story of people organizing, marching, lobbying to curb a plague that vast swaths of society saw as just punishment for allegedly immoral acts. When the film premiered at the Sundance Film Festival in Park City, Utah, I spoke to its director, David France, and Peter Staley, one of the longest AIDS survivors in the country. In the mid-'80s, after being diagnosed, Staley left his job as a bond trader in New York to work as a full-time activist. In 1987, he helped found ACT UP. I began by asking director David France why he made How to Survive a Plague.
This is a story that I've known for a long time, and it seemed to me that the stories about AIDS have all been about the arrival of the virus and the way the virus impacted the community and the devastation, really. But the truth about the epidemic, especially those darker days of the epidemic, is that there was a lot of amazing activity that took place. And the community really rallied and made a difference. And that part of the story about the plague had never been told. So that's what I wanted to go and try to see if I could wrap my hands around.
And it's really a story about strategy and about activism in the face of death. So it was a life and death struggle. Peter, when were you diagnosed?
I found out shortly after Rock Hudson became a major news story when he disclosed that he was dying of AIDS in the fall of 1985. And the country was in a complete panic at that point. Parents were pulling their children out of school. There was a lot of fear. There were no drugs. There were no treatments. So it was a frightening time to find out.
And that's when you were tested?
That's when I was first tested. They had only isolated the virus about 9 months before that, and they quickly developed an assay to test for it.
Is it fair to say you're one of the longest surviving people with AIDS?
There are those that were infected earlier, even before we first started seeing those dying from AIDS. There were some infected in the late 70s who are still with us today, thanks to the treatments that are out there. But not many got through the 80s and 90s, so I feel very lucky.
So talk about your journey of activism. You certainly didn't start as an activist.
No, I was a bond trader at J.P. Morgan on Wall Street, trading U.S. government bonds during the Reagan debt years. It was quite a heady job, and I kind of hated it, actually. But I found out I was positive and thought I only had a couple years to live, and then
what spurred you to leave that job?
Well, my immune system collapsed and I went on disability. But by that time, I was already a member of ACT UP New York, who had its first demonstration outside the front door of the bank on Wall Street.
Actually, David, it's described in the film, the bigotry you felt within at J.P. Morgan.
Yeah.
You weren't out at the time.
No, I was deeply in the closet, and I got handed a flyer for that very first demo, and we were all on the trading floor, and everybody had got handed the flyer. And there was a discussion on the trading floor, and my mentor, the head trader, said, you know, I think they all deserve to die. And I just had to sit there at my desk and steam and fume about it. But I went home that night, and there we were, those demonstrators, the lead story on CBS News, and with Dan Rather, which I always watched, and I said, I've got to join that group, and that's how it started.
Everybody, yeah, just wait outside the elevators. Hi, we're with ACT UP, and we're doing an active syphilis obedience. Please remain calm. Jim and Peter, we're in. Send all press.
Hello. We're from ACT UP New York.
We're here to basically demand that you start to develop this drug as a potentially life-saving therapy for people with breast cancer and Kaposi sarcoma.
You already have the blood of several thousand people on your hands, and those of us like me who have Kaposi sarcoma are going to die, and we are here until we get arrested.
You seem to know nothing about the actual details of the development of this drug. Maybe you're just not telling us.
Mr. Borsick, have you scheduled a meeting with the FDA?
Yes, we can.
We have helped many companies through this process. We can take a drug from your test tube to the market in under 2 years if you work with us. And we will pave the way for you with the Food and Drug Administration. But this total reluctance on your part is going to get you nowhere. It'll end up killing us, all right?
See this dark mark on my forehead? That's Kaposi sarcoma. It's going to spread. It's going to kill me. You're coming to my funeral because you're the man responsible. You are my murderer in your shirt and tie.
So let's talk about ACT UP, the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, and the strategizing. I mean, you're talking about now a presidential election year. You're talking about a year we've just come out of, a year of uprisings from Tunisia and Egypt to the Occupy movement all over this country. This, in a sense, is a kind of primer on what to do and maybe what not to do. David, talk about the whole trajectory of protest.
The ACT UP story, and I think the important part of the ACT UP story is that it took almost 10 years for the kind of impact that they were looking for to actually be achieved. And I think with those other movements, we're impatient for victories and for well-defined strategies. And How to Survive a Plague details is how those strategies developed and how an organization of people who were simply desperate and terrified became a movement that could really change the way healthcare is delivered, not just in America but throughout the world, how science is conducted, how drugs are researched and approved. And the strategy that ACT UP developed was one which they call the inside-outside approach. The people who were very well educated, self-educated in the issues of science and regulation in the whole drug world. And Peter was a member of that aspect of the movement of ACT UP. And then the people on the streets, the soldiers who could bring thousands of people to bear to push forward the points that were being requested and demanded by the activists on the inside.
David, you covered the AIDS crisis, epidemic, plague, before it had a name. What were you doing?
I was covering it for the gay presses when, and you may remember this back then, that the mainstream press wasn't covering AIDS at all. And it was the only place to find news about AIDS was in Gay Community News, the New York Native, a very small circulation gay publications. It was before the internet. It was before this ease of communication that we have. And I began to cover AIDS because I needed to find out what was happening. I wasn't a journalist at the time, and ultimately it gave me a path for how I could respond to the epidemic. And so I kept at it starting in 1982.
And how did the coverage change?
There was really no coverage through 1985, 86, 87. ACT UP, one of their first goals was to get AIDS into the national dialogue, and they did it pretty effectively. The coverage wasn't good. in 87, 88, 89. There were AIDS panic stories. There were AIDS victim stories. At the time, people were still burning the houses of neighbors who had AIDS to try to keep their kids from going to public school. So it was a kind of a wartime sort of coverage. The medical coverage, the scientific coverage, was just as spotty, and it turns out, and as you see in How to Survive a Plague, it's because there was very little medical and scientific work going on, even, to respond to the crisis.
Peter, you were very much not only on the activist end, but the medical activist end and the research. Talk about what you were demanding. You were challenging the whole notion of what it meant to be an expert. You were taking on the bureaucrats, the corporations. How did you get in there? How many times were you arrested, by the way?
I was arrested 10 times, and thanks to a lot of great pro bono lawyers, I don't have a record, but and definitely attended many more demonstrations beyond that. But we started with mostly just an outside activism process of these huge demonstrations at the doorsteps of buildings in D.C., and then demanding meetings, and with that, the pressure of the demos, we would be granted these meetings. And then the dialogue would start, and we'd keep meeting and come up with lists of demands, and then demonstrate again when those demands were not met. So it was a real inside-outside process.
Three major things that control NIH research: stupidity, incompetence, and greed. Those are the three major driving forces behind what's going on here and why there are no treatments out there for people living with this disease. In that building down that way, Dr. Anthony Fauci is reciting the research priorities for the National Institutes of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. We're down here because we think we should be deciding the research priorities, because these are the people who know what's going on, because they're dealing with it every day.
Talk about Merck.
Merck, they were an amazing company, because they actually kind of by the time that they started looking at protease inhibitors, this was almost in the early 90s, and ACT UP and the Treatment and Data Committee of ACT UP was fully educated by then. So we were meeting with all the pharmaceutical companies. They really respected that we had done our homework, and we were able to help them design their trials because of all the work we had done with the FDA, so that they could get the drug approved as quickly as possible, and that we could really get the answers on whether the drug worked in combination with the older AIDS drug.
The big innovation, I think, that the activists in ACT UP and later TAG, the Treatment Action Group, brought was a biostatistical innovation, which is a new way to design trial protocols for new drugs that would allow the drug to be tested quicker and results to be reliable results to be produced in a quicker way that brought down the amount of time it took to come up with those answers from 7 to 12 years prior to their work to 2 years and under, sometimes as quick as 6 months.
Peter, how do you do what you called humane trials? And I mean, you were taking on the entire medical corporate establishment. Why did you all know? I mean, you had been a bond trader, for God's sakes, how they should be conducting health clinical trials.
We actually started, we had a couple people that joined the group, that joined ACT UP, who had medical backgrounds, and they started doing weekly classes for the rest of us, and we used textbooks on immunology. I mean, we really all went back to square one and just crash course in trying to learn the science. And then after the first drugs were approved and there was this kind of burst of hope that maybe we were on the right path, everything came crashing down in the early 90s when we realized those drugs really didn't help that much. And there was a long period of depression and how we were going to dig ourselves out of this hole. And that's when ACT UP started this, actually started making friendships with these, the best biostatisticians in the country who had been criticizing a lot of the AIDS research that had happening. And we adopted their criticisms and learned what they were talking about and took that back to Washington and the drug companies and said, this is what we need to do to get actual answers of how to save lives with these drugs.
There was also a debate going on that you were getting too insider, and people were saying we got to take to the streets. You guys are just too cozy with those in power.
It's the story of a movement that begins to rip apart, and I'm amazed, given the amount of carnage that was going on, the amount of members that were dying on a weekly basis, how long ACT UP remained unified and strong, but it began to splinter about 5 years in. Fortunately, a lot of us kept working, and Treatment Action Group was formed, and it did amazing work, and ACT UP lives to this day, so there's still a lot more work to do.
AIDS activist and survivor Peter Staley and film director David France talking about the new documentary, How to Survive a Plague. It's going to be airing at the Walter Reed Theater at Lincoln Center on Saturday night here in New York City, as well as at the Museum of Modern Art on Monday before its fall release. We will continue our conversation with them after break on this 25th anniversary of the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, or ACT UP.